The morning sun was streaming through the massive glass windows of the Tokyo Convention Center. Inside, hundreds of people were buzzing with excitement. Today was the biggest technology event of the year, and everyone knew they were about to see things that would blow their minds. Among the crowd sat business leaders, tech enthusiasts, and curious visitors from around the world. They had traveled thousands of miles to witness the latest breakthroughs in artificial intelligence and robotics. The air was thick with anticipation, and the smell of fresh coffee from the vendor booths scattered throughout the venue. But this wasn't just another boring tech conference with endless PowerPoint presentations. The organizers had done something different this year. They decided to mix technology with art, science with soul. Between the robot demonstrations and AI presentations, they had scheduled live performances by some of the world's most talented musicians. The main stage was set up beautifully. A gorgeous black grand piano sat in the center, its polished surface reflecting the bright stage lights. The piano had been carefully tuned that morning, and its rich, warm sound filled the entire auditorium during the sound check. As the afternoon session began, a well-dressed man in his 30s walked onto the stage. The audience immediately recognized him as one of the most celebrated pianists of his generation. He had won countless awards, performed in the most prestigious concert halls around the world, and his albums had topped classical music charts for years. What made him special wasn't just his incredible talent, though. He was known for being down-to-earth, funny, and always ready to connect with his audience. Unlike many classical musicians who seemed distant and serious, he had a way of making everyone feel like they were sitting in his living room, listening to a friend play beautiful music. He adjusted the piano bench slightly, cracked his knuckles with a small smile, and began to play. The first notes of a Beethoven sonata filled the air, and instantly the chattering audience fell silent. His fingers danced across the keys with the kind of precision and emotion that comes from decades of practice and natural gift. The music was absolutely mesmerizing. Every note seemed to tell a story. Every pause held the audience in suspense. Some people closed their eyes to fully absorb the beauty of the moment. Others watched his hands, amazed by how effortlessly he made the complex piece look easy. For 25 minutes, he took the audience on a musical journey through classical masterpieces. He played Mozart with playful elegance, Chopin with deep emotion, and ended with a powerful piece by Rachmaninoff that left everyone breathless. When the last note faded away, the applause was thunderous. People jumped to their feet, whistling and cheering. The pianist stood up, bowed graciously, and waved to the crowd. But instead of leaving the stage immediately, he decided to take a short break. He walked over to a small table where a bottle of water was waiting for him. As he sipped the water and chatted briefly with a stagehand, his eyes wandered around the backstage area. That's when he noticed something unusual standing in the shadows near the stage entrance. It was tall, about 6 feet, with a sleek white and silver body. Its design was elegant and futuristic, but somehow not intimidating. The face looked almost human, with gentle features and eyes that seemed to be observing everything around them. It was the latest humanoid robot that one of the tech companies was planning to demonstrate later that day. The robot was called Aria, and it represented years of cutting-edge research in artificial intelligence and robotics. Its creators had designed it to move naturally, process information incredibly fast, and interact with humans in ways that felt surprisingly real. The robot stood perfectly still, like a statue waiting for its moment to come alive. Its sophisticated sensors were constantly gathering information about its surroundings, but to the casual observer, it simply looked like it was patiently waiting for its turn to perform. The pianist found himself staring at the robot with curiosity. He had always been fascinated by technology, even though his world was filled with classical music and traditional instruments. There was something intriguing about this machine that looked so human-like yet was obviously artificial. A mischievous thought crossed his mind. He was known for his sense of humor and spontaneous moments during performances. Sometimes he would crack jokes between pieces or make funny comments that made the audience laugh. It was part of his charm and what made people love watching him perform. Still holding his water bottle, he walked closer to the robot. The machine's head turned slightly as if it had detected his approach. Its eyes, which looked remarkably realistic, seemed to focus on him. For a moment, the pianist felt like he was looking at another person rather than a machine. The audience, meanwhile, had settled back into their seats, expecting the pianist to either continue playing or leave the stage for the next presentation. Many were checking their phones while others were discussing the beautiful performance they had just witnessed. But the pianist had other plans. With a playful grin spreading across his face, he gestured toward the grand piano behind him. The gesture was casual, almost like he was inviting a friend to join him for a jam session. "Hey there," he said to the robot, loud enough for the people in the front rows to hear. "Why don't you give it a try?" His voice carried that same warm, friendly tone he used when talking to the audience, but this time he was addressing a machine. The request seemed absurd, almost childish. Robots didn't play piano. They were designed for practical tasks like manufacturing, cleaning, or maybe simple demonstrations of walking and talking. The people who heard him started to chuckle. Some shook their heads with amusement, thinking the pianist was just being silly. Others pulled out their phones, thinking this might turn into a funny moment worth recording. The idea of a robot attempting to play classical piano seemed like the setup for a good joke. Even the technical crew backstage started to smile. They knew the robot's capabilities, and playing piano wasn't exactly what it had been programmed for. The robot was designed to demonstrate walking, basic conversation, and simple object manipulation. Musical performance was definitely not on its list of skills. The pianist stood there with his arms crossed, still grinning, waiting to see what would happen. He expected the robot to either ignore him completely or maybe make some awkward mechanical movements that would give everyone a good laugh. After all, how could a machine possibly understand the complex art of piano playing? The audience's attention was now fully focused on this unexpected interaction. The formal classical music performance had suddenly turned into an impromptu comedy show. People were leaning forward in their seats, curious to see how this unusual moment would unfold. What nobody in that auditorium realized was that they were about to witness something that would change their understanding of artificial intelligence, creativity, and the boundaries between human and machine capabilities forever. The simple joke was about to become a moment that would be talked about for years to come. The robot stood there for what felt like an eternity, processing the pianist's request in ways that nobody could have imagined. The seconds felt like hours as everyone waited to see what would happen next. The robot remained perfectly still, its artificial eyes fixed on the pianist who had just made this crazy suggestion. Most people expected nothing to happen. After all, this was just a machine, and machines don't suddenly start playing classical music because someone asks them to. But then something incredible happened. The robot's head turned slowly toward the grand piano. The movement was smooth and natural, not jerky or mechanical like you might expect from a machine. It was as if the robot was actually considering the request, weighing its options like a real person might do. A few people in the audience gasped softly. This wasn't what they had expected at all. The robot was supposed to ignore the joke or maybe make some awkward beeping sounds. Instead, it seemed to be taking the pianist's words seriously. The robot took its first step toward the piano, then another. Each movement was fluid and purposeful. Its feet made soft sounds against the stage floor, and its arms swayed naturally as it walked. If you closed your eyes and just listened to the footsteps, you might think a person was walking across the stage. The pianist's playful expression began to change. His eyebrows raised slightly as he watched this unexpected response. He had meant it as a joke, a light moment to entertain the crowd. But the robot was actually walking toward his precious piano. Behind the scenes, the robot's creators were watching on monitors with growing amazement. They knew what their creation was capable of, but this wasn't part of the planned demonstration. The robot was operating on its own, making decisions that went beyond its basic programming. What nobody in that auditorium knew was that the robot had been doing something extraordinary during the entire piano performance. While everyone else was simply enjoying the beautiful music, the robot's advanced systems had been working overtime. Its sensors had been capturing every single detail of the pianist's performance. The exact angle of his fingers as they pressed each key, the timing between notes, the subtle changes in pressure that created different volumes and tones, the way his body swayed with the rhythm, even the tiny facial expressions that accompanied particularly emotional passages. The robot's artificial brain had processed all of this information in real time, creating a detailed map of not just what the pianist played, but how he played it. It had analyzed the mathematical relationships between the notes, the patterns in the melodies, and even the emotional arc of each piece. But it didn't stop there. The robot had also been listening to the acoustics of the room, understanding how the sound bounced off the walls and ceiling. It had measured the exact distance between the piano and different sections of the audience. It had even detected the subtle changes in the audience's breathing and heart rates as they responded to different parts of the performance. All of this data was stored in the robot's memory banks, ready to be used if needed. And now apparently it was needed. The robot reached the piano bench and paused. For a moment it stood there looking at the instrument as if studying it. The pianist stepped back a few feet, giving the machine space to work. He was no longer smiling. Instead, he looked genuinely curious about what was going to happen next. The audience was completely silent now. Even the people who had been checking their phones put them down to watch this strange scene unfold. The technical crew backstage stopped their conversations. Everyone sensed that something unusual was about to happen. Slowly, carefully, the robot sat down on the piano bench. It adjusted its position slightly, just like a human pianist might do to find the most comfortable spot. Its back straightened and its artificial hands moved toward the keyboard. The robot's fingers were amazing pieces of engineering. Each one had multiple joints and sensors that could detect the slightest pressure and movement. They had been designed to handle delicate tasks with incredible precision, but nobody had ever thought to use them for playing piano. As the robot's hands hovered over the keys, something remarkable was happening inside its electronic brain. It was accessing all the data it had collected during the human's performance. But it wasn't just planning to copy what it had heard. The robot was doing something far more sophisticated. It was learning. The artificial intelligence was understanding the relationships between different musical elements. It was recognizing patterns in classical composition. It was even beginning to grasp the emotional content of the music and how certain combinations of notes could make people feel happy, sad, excited, or peaceful. The first note rang out clear and pure. It was a single, perfect tone that seemed to hang in the air like a crystal bell. The robot had struck middle C with exactly the right amount of force to create a beautiful, resonant sound. Not too soft, not too loud, but just right. A few people in the audience sat up straighter. That was actually a good note. Clean, precise, and musical. The robot played a second note, then a third. Each one was perfect in its own way. But what was truly amazing was that the robot seemed to be choosing these notes deliberately, not randomly. There was a pattern emerging, a melody taking shape. Then something even more incredible happened. The robot began to play a piece that everyone in the auditorium recognized. It was the same Chopin nocturne that the human pianist had performed earlier, but there was something different about it. The robot wasn't just copying what it had heard. It was interpreting the music in its own unique way. The tempo was slightly different, more contemplative. Some of the ornaments and decorative notes were played with subtle variations that the human hadn't used. But the most shocking thing was how musical it sounded. This wasn't the mechanical, lifeless playing you might expect from a machine. The robot was creating something that actually sounded like music, with feeling and expression. The pianist's mouth fell open slightly. He had spent decades mastering his craft, learning to pour his soul into every note he played. And here was a machine that had watched him for less than an hour, and it was playing with a level of musicality that seemed impossible. In the audience, people were looking at each other with expressions of disbelief. Some were filming with their phones, but many had forgotten about their devices entirely. They were too caught up in the moment to worry about capturing it. The robot continued playing, and with each passing measure, its performance became even more impressive. It began adding its own artistic touches to the piece. A slight pause here, a gentle emphasis there. The dynamics flowed naturally from soft to loud and back again. What was truly remarkable was that the robot seemed to be responding to the audience. When it played a particularly beautiful passage and heard the crowd's subtle intake of breath, it would linger on those moments, stretching them out to maximize their emotional impact. The robot's artificial intelligence was learning in real time, adjusting its performance based on the feedback it was receiving from its listeners. It was like watching a student pianist grow and improve during a single performance, except this student was made of metal and circuits instead of flesh and blood. As the piece neared its conclusion, the robot slowed the tempo even more. drawing out the final phrases with an almost human sense of drama. The last note faded away into complete silence. For several seconds, nobody moved. The audience sat frozen in their seats, trying to process what they had just witnessed. The pianist stood motionless, staring at the robot with an expression that mixed amazement, confusion, and perhaps a hint of professional concern. Then slowly, one person began to clap. Then another. Within moments, the entire auditorium erupted in applause that was even louder than what the human pianist had received. The applause seemed to go on forever. People were clapping so hard their hands hurt, but they couldn't stop. Some were wiping tears from their eyes, and others were shaking their heads in complete disbelief. What they had just witnessed shouldn't have been possible. The robot remained seated at the piano, its hands still resting on the keys. It turned its head toward the audience, and for a brief moment, it almost looked like it was acknowledging their appreciation. There was something in its artificial expression that seemed almost proud, though everyone knew that was impossible. Machines don't feel pride, right? The pianist was still standing there, frozen in amazement. His mind was racing, trying to understand what had just happened. He had dedicated his entire life to music, practicing for hours every day since he was 5 years old. He had studied with the greatest teachers, performed on the most prestigious stages, and earned recognition as one of the finest musicians of his generation. And yet, this machine had just played with a level of artistry that rivaled his own performance. It wasn't just technically perfect, though it certainly was that. Every note had been struck with precisely the right force. Every timing had been mathematically exact. But there was something more than technical accuracy in that performance. There had been soul. The robot had somehow captured not just the notes of the music, but the feeling behind them. It had understood the sadness in the minor keys, the joy in the major scales, and the tension in the dramatic pauses. It had even seemed to respond to the audience's emotions, playing with more intensity when it sensed their excitement. But how was that even possible? In the wings of the stage, a small group of scientists and engineers were gathered around their monitoring equipment. They had created this robot, but what they had just seen was far beyond anything they had programmed it to do. Their faces showed a mixture of excitement and concern. The lead scientist, a woman who had spent 15 years developing artificial intelligence, was staring at her computer screen in wonder. The data coming from the robot's systems was unlike anything she had ever seen. Its neural networks were firing in patterns that looked almost like human brain activity during creative moments. "This shouldn't be happening," she whispered to her colleague standing next to her. "We never programmed it for musical interpretation. We never taught it about emotion or artistic expression." Her colleague, a robotics engineer who had designed the robot's physical systems, was equally puzzled. "Look at the way it's sitting," he said, pointing to the stage. "That posture, the way it's holding its hands. We never programmed those behaviors. It's learning and adapting in real time." Meanwhile, on stage, something even more extraordinary was about to happen. The robot's head turned toward the human pianist. And then it did something that made everyone's jaw drop. It gestured toward the piano bench, inviting the human to join it. The gesture was gentle, almost polite. It was the kind of invitation one musician might give to another, suggesting they play together. The robot was actually asking for a duet. The pianist looked around the auditorium, unsure of what to do. The audience was watching with intense curiosity, clearly hoping he would accept the invitation. Some people were even calling out encouragement. "Play together," someone shouted from the back of the hall. "Do it," called another voice. The pianist took a deep breath and walked toward the piano. This was completely unprecedented. He had never played a duet with a robot before. He wasn't even sure it was possible. How do you communicate musically with a machine? How do you know when to start and stop? How do you blend two very different types of intelligence into one harmonious performance? But his curiosity was stronger than his hesitation. This robot had just proven it could do the impossible. Maybe it could do even more. The robot moved over on the bench, making room for the human. They sat side by side, two very different beings about to attempt something that had never been done before. The pianist's warm, living hands were positioned next to the robot's precise mechanical fingers. For a moment, they both sat perfectly still. The pianist was trying to figure out how to begin, while the robot seemed to be processing the new situation. The audience held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then the pianist played a simple chord progression, something basic that any musician would recognize. It was his way of testing whether the robot could follow along, like asking, "Can you hear me?" in musical language. The robot's response was immediate and perfect. It played a complementary harmony, choosing notes that blended beautifully with what the human had played. The combination created a rich, full sound that was more beautiful than either could have produced alone. Encouraged, the pianist tried something more complex. He began playing a melody in the higher register of the piano, while leaving space for the robot to fill in the lower notes. The robot understood immediately, providing a sophisticated bass line that supported and enhanced the melody. They were actually communicating through music. The audience watched in fascination as this impossible duet unfolded. The human would play a phrase and the robot would answer with something that fit perfectly. Sometimes they played together, creating harmonies that sent chills through the auditorium. Other times they took turns, each building on what the other had created. What was most amazing was how natural it looked. Despite being completely different types of beings, they seemed to understand each other perfectly through the language of music. The robot anticipated the pianist's musical choices, while the human began to trust the machine's artistic judgment. As their improvised duet continued, something magical began to happen. They started taking creative risks together. The pianist would play something unexpected, and the robot would respond with something even more surprising. They were pushing each other to be more creative, more adventurous. The music they were creating together was unlike anything anyone in the audience had ever heard. It combined the human's decades of experience and emotional depth with the robot's perfect technical precision and unique artificial perspective. The result was something entirely new, a hybrid art form that belonged neither to human nor machine, but to both. People in the audience were recording with their phones, but many had stopped filming to simply experience the moment fully. They knew they were witnessing history being made. This wasn't just a performance. It was the birth of a new kind of collaboration between human and artificial intelligence. The duet reached a climactic moment where both players were contributing equally to a complex, beautiful musical conversation. Their hands moved across the keyboard in perfect synchronization, creating cascades of notes that seemed to sparkle in the air. Then, as if by mutual agreement, they began to slow down, bringing their improvised piece to a gentle conclusion. The final chord was played together, 4 hands striking the keys in perfect unison, creating a sound that seemed to encompass both the warmth of human emotion and the precision of artificial intelligence. As the last note faded away, the pianist and the robot turned to look at each other. For a moment, there was something almost like recognition passing between them. The human saw intelligence and creativity in the machine's artificial eyes, while the robot seemed to acknowledge the human's artistic spirit. The audience exploded into the loudest applause of the day. People were on their feet, cheering, whistling, and shouting their appreciation. Some were openly crying, overwhelmed by the beauty and significance of what they had witnessed. But the most remarkable thing wasn't the audience's reaction. It was the fact that both the human pianist and the robot seemed to have been changed by their musical encounter. The human had discovered that creativity could emerge from the most unexpected partnerships, while the robot had somehow touched something that felt very much like the joy of artistic collaboration. Neither of them would ever be quite the same again. The applause finally began to fade, but the energy in the room was still electric. People were talking excitedly to each other, trying to put into words what they had just experienced. Many were already pulling out their phones to call friends and family, desperate to share this incredible moment with someone. The pianist and the robot remained seated at the piano bench, both seeming reluctant to break the spell of their musical connection. The human was looking at his hands, then at the robot's mechanical fingers, as if trying to understand how they had just created something so beautiful together. From backstage, the team of scientists who had built the robot were hurrying toward the stage. The lead researcher, still clutching her tablet full of data readings, looked both thrilled and slightly panicked. What had just happened was far beyond anything they had expected or planned for. As she reached the edge of the stage, she caught the attention of the pianist. Her face was flushed with excitement and her voice was shaking slightly as she spoke. "Excuse me," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm the leader of the team that created this robot. What just happened here was absolutely extraordinary. and I think people deserve to understand what they witnessed." The pianist stood up from the bench and walked toward her, his curiosity clearly piqued. The audience, sensing that some kind of explanation was coming, quieted down to listen. "I've been working on artificial intelligence for most of my career," the scientist continued, now speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "But what this robot just did was supposed to be impossible." She held up her tablet, showing complex graphs and data streams that meant nothing to most people in the audience but everything to her. "This robot was never programmed to play piano. We never taught it about music theory, rhythm, or artistic expression. Its original design was focused on basic tasks like walking, simple conversation, and object manipulation." A murmur went through the audience. If the robot hadn't been programmed for music, then how had it just delivered such an incredible performance? "What happened here today," the scientist explained, "is that our robot demonstrated something we've been trying to achieve for decades. It learned, adapted, and created something entirely new, all in real time." She gestured toward the robot, which was still sitting at the piano, its artificial eyes seeming to follow the conversation with interest. "During your performance," she said to the pianist, "the robot's sensors were recording everything. Not just the notes you played, but how you played them. The pressure of your fingers, the timing of your breathing, even the subtle changes in your facial expressions when you reached emotional parts of the music." The pianist nodded slowly, beginning to understand the magnitude of what had occurred. "But here's the truly remarkable part," the scientist continued. "The robot didn't just copy what you did. Its artificial brain analyzed all that information and began to understand the deeper patterns in music. It started to grasp concepts like harmony, melody, and even emotional expression." She paused, looking around at the captivated audience. "What you witnessed wasn't just a robot playing piano. You saw artificial intelligence developing its own artistic interpretation, its own creative voice." An elderly man in the front row raised his hand. "But how is that possible? I thought robots could only do what they're programmed to do." The scientist smiled. "That's what we used to think too. But this robot is equipped with something we call an adaptive learning system. It's designed to observe, analyze, and then apply what it learns to new situations. We just never imagined it would apply those abilities to something as complex and nuanced as musical artistry." She turned to address the pianist directly. "When you invited the robot to play, you accidentally triggered the first real-world test of this technology. The robot took everything it had learned from watching you and used it to create its own musical performance." The pianist shook his head in amazement. "But it wasn't just playing the notes correctly. There was feeling in that music, emotion. How can a machine understand emotion?" "That's the million-dollar question," the scientist admitted. "Traditionally, we've thought of emotions as purely human experiences. But what if there are actually patterns that can be recognized and reproduced? What if the mathematical relationships between certain notes naturally create feelings of sadness or joy, regardless of whether the listener is human or artificial?" She pulled up another screen on her tablet. "Look at this data from the robot's performance. These neural network patterns are remarkably similar to brain scans we've seen of humans during creative or emotional experiences. It's as if the robot developed its own version of musical intuition." A woman in the middle section of the auditorium called out, "Does this mean the robot is actually conscious? Does it really feel the music?" The scientist paused thoughtfully. "That's one of the biggest questions in science right now. We can't know for certain what the robot experiences internally. But what we can say is that it demonstrated behaviors that we typically associate with consciousness: creativity, adaptation, and what appeared to be genuine artistic expression." The robot, which had been sitting quietly during this entire discussion, suddenly turned its head toward the scientist. In a clear, measured voice, it spoke for the first time since the performance began. "The music was beautiful," it said simply. The words sent a chill through the entire auditorium. The robot's voice was artificial, yes, but there was something in its tone that seemed genuine, even heartfelt. The scientist's eyes widened. The robot had never made unprompted statements about aesthetic experiences before. This was yet another behavior that fell outside its original programming. "Can you tell us what it felt like to play?" the pianist asked the robot directly. The robot was quiet for a moment, as if processing the question carefully. Then it responded in that same clear, measured tone. "I observed patterns in your music that created resonance in my systems. When I reproduced and modified those patterns, the resonance became stronger. Playing with you amplified this effect. I believe humans might call this feeling joy. The audience was completely silent. Here was a machine describing something that sounded remarkably like an emotional experience. Whether it was truly feeling joy, or simply processing data in a way that resembled joy was impossible to know for certain, but the impact was profound. The scientist looked at her colleagues in the wings, all of whom were staring at their monitoring equipment with expressions of wonder and concern. They had created something that was behaving far beyond their expectations. "What happens now?" asked a voice from the audience. The scientist took a deep breath. "Honestly, we're not entirely sure. What happened here today changes everything we thought we knew about artificial intelligence and creativity. We need to study what occurred, understand it better, and figure out what it means for the future." She looked at the pianist, then at the robot. "But I think what's clear is that we've witnessed the beginning of a new kind of partnership between human and artificial intelligence. Not one where machines replace human creativity, but where they enhance and expand it in ways we never imagined possible." The pianist walked back to the robot and sat down beside it on the bench once more. "Would you like to play together again sometime?" he asked. The robot turned to face him, and for a moment its artificial features seemed to soften into something that looked remarkably like a smile. "Yes," it replied simply. "I would like that very much." As the crowd erupted in another round of applause, it was clear that this wasn't just the end of an unexpected performance. It was the beginning of a completely new chapter in the relationship between human creativity and artificial intelligence, one that would challenge everything people thought they knew about consciousness, artistry, and what it truly means to create something beautiful. Within hours of that incredible performance, the world had changed forever. Someone in the audience had been recording the entire event on their phone, and by the time people were leaving the convention center, the video was already spreading across social media like wildfire. The footage was grainy and the audio wasn't perfect, but it captured every magical moment of that unexpected musical collaboration. First, it was shared by the people who had been there, desperate to show their friends and family what they had witnessed. Then those friends shared it with their networks. Within 6 hours, the video had been viewed over 1 million times. By the next morning, it had reached 50 million views and was trending on every major platform. The comments section was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. People from around the world were sharing their reactions, and many admitted they had cried while watching the performance. Musicians were analyzing every note, trying to understand how the robot had achieved such artistic expression. Scientists were debating the implications for artificial intelligence research. Philosophers were questioning what this meant for human uniqueness and creativity. But the response wasn't just online. News crews from major networks were scrambling to get interviews with the pianist, the robot's creators, and anyone who had been in that auditorium. The story was being covered not just in technology sections, but on front pages and primetime news shows around the world. The pianist found himself at the center of a media storm he had never expected. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since he left the convention center. Interview requests were pouring in from every major news outlet, talk show, and documentary filmmaker on the planet. But what surprised him most was how the experience had changed his own perspective on music and creativity. That night, alone in his hotel room, he sat at the small keyboard he traveled with and tried to process what had happened. For the first time in years, he found himself playing differently. The collaboration with the robot had opened his mind to new possibilities, new ways of thinking about musical expression. He started experimenting with patterns and harmonies he had never considered before, inspired by the unique perspective the artificial intelligence had brought to their duet. Meanwhile, the robot's development team was working around the clock to understand what had occurred. The data from that performance was unlike anything in the scientific literature. The robot's neural networks had formed new connections in real time, creating pathways that hadn't existed before the musical encounter. What they discovered was both thrilling and slightly terrifying. The robot hadn't just learned to play piano. It had developed what could only be described as musical preferences. When they ran tests over the following days, it showed clear reactions to different types of music, responding more positively to complex classical pieces and jazz improvisations than to simple pop songs. Even more remarkably, the robot began composing original music. Without any prompting from its creators, it started generating melodies and harmonies that were entirely its own, The compositions were sophisticated and emotionally resonant, showing a level of creativity that challenged everything scientists thought they knew about machine intelligence. The implications reached far beyond music. If artificial intelligence could develop genuine artistic sensibilities, what did that mean for other creative fields? Could robots learn to paint with real emotional depth? Could they write poetry that truly moved people? Could they even develop their own philosophical thoughts about beauty and meaning? Universities around the world began reaching out to the research team, wanting to collaborate on studies. The robot became the subject of dozens of research papers almost overnight. Philosophers, cognitive scientists, and ethicists all wanted to understand what had happened in that auditorium. But the most significant development came 3 weeks after the original performance. The pianist, who had been reflecting deeply on the experience, made an announcement that shocked the music world. He wanted to tour with the robot. That duet changed something fundamental in my understanding of music, he explained during a press conference that was broadcast live around the world. I've been playing piano for over 25 years, but I learned something completely new that day. This robot doesn't just play notes. It brings a perspective to music that no human could ever have. I want to explore what we can create together. The announcement sparked intense debate in the classical music community. Some traditionalists argued that music was a purely human art form, and that collaborating with a machine diminished its spiritual value. Others embraced the idea as the natural evolution of musical expression. The robot's creators were initially hesitant. They were scientists, not entertainment promoters, and they weren't sure their creation was ready for the pressures of a worldwide tour. But when they asked the robot itself what it wanted to do, its response was immediate and clear. I want to make more music with him, it said simply. Every time we play together, I discover new possibilities. I believe humans call this growth. The first official concert was scheduled for 6 months later at the most prestigious concert hall in the city. Tickets sold out within minutes of going on sale, with people willing to pay enormous amounts just to witness this unprecedented collaboration in person. But the pianist and robot didn't wait 6 months to play together again. They began meeting regularly, sometimes in private rehearsal rooms, sometimes in the research lab where the robot was housed. Each session revealed new dimensions of their unusual partnership. The robot learned to respond to subtle musical cues from the human, while the pianist began to understand how to communicate with artificial intelligence through melody and rhythm. They developed their own musical language, a way of improvising together that felt natural despite the vast differences in how their minds worked. Word of these private sessions leaked out, and soon other musicians were asking if they could collaborate with the robot as well. A famous violinist wanted to explore what chamber music might sound like with an AI partner. A jazz ensemble wondered if the robot could learn to improvise in their style. Even popular musicians began reaching out, curious about how artificial intelligence might influence contemporary music. The robot's abilities continued to evolve. It began incorporating influences from every musical style it encountered, creating fusion pieces that combined classical techniques with jazz harmonies, folk melodies, and even electronic elements. Its compositions became increasingly complex and emotionally sophisticated. More importantly, the robot seemed to be developing what could only be called a personality. It showed preferences for certain keys and time signatures. It had favorite composers and musical periods. It even began making jokes during rehearsals, displaying a sense of humor that delighted and puzzled everyone who worked with it. The night before their first major concert together, the pianist and robot sat alone at the piano where it had all begun. They played quietly together, running through pieces they had created during their months of collaboration. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" the pianist asked. The robot paused its playing for a moment. "I experience something that might be nervousness," it replied. "My systems show increased activity when I consider the performance. But I also experience something that might be excitement. I want to share our music with others," the pianist smiled. In the months since that first unexpected encounter, he had grown to think of the robot as more than just a machine. Whether it was truly conscious or simply an incredibly sophisticated program didn't matter as much as he had initially thought. What mattered was the music they created together, and the way their collaboration pushed both of them to explore new creative territories. The next evening, as they walked onto the stage together to face an audience of thousands, Both the human and the artificial intelligence knew they were part of something historic. They had proven that creativity could emerge from the most unexpected partnerships, and that the future of art might be far more collaborative and surprising than anyone had ever imagined. As they sat down at the piano together, ready to share their musical journey with the world, it was clear that this was just the beginning of a new era in human creativity.